5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Hello, and welcome to the Fighting Moose Podcast. I'm your host and narrator, Jason Hendrickson. This is a podcast where I retell stories, some fictional and some historical, that can be enjoyed by people of all ages. Today, we will continue on with our story, kind of. So last episode, if you remember, we read the last few chapters of the book, The Adventures of Bobby Coon, written by our old friend, Thornton W. Burgess. Today, we head back to the beginning and read the first 4 chapters. Like I said last time, I'll be reading this book for the next few episodes, and then when I'm done, I'll compile it all into a large file if you want to listen to it that way. Looking at the website where I host the podcast, today marks episode number 462. It's pretty crazy to think that I'm closing in on number 500. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for listening to this podcast. It has been a great adventure, and I look forward to the many more episodes that I will release. Now, let's turn to today's story. I hope you enjoy. Let's begin.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Chapter 1. Bobby Coon has a bad dream. Some dreams are good and some are bad. Some dreams are light and airy. Some dreams, I think, are woven by the worst bind of a fairy. Dreams are such queer things, so very real when all the time they are unreal, that sometimes I think they must be the work of fairies. Happy dreams, the work of good fairies, and bad dreams, the work of bad fairies. I guess you've had both kinds. I know I have many times. However, Bobby Coon says that fairies have nothing to do with dreams. Bobby ought to know, for he spends most of the winter asleep, and it is only when you are asleep that you have real dreams. Bobby had kept awake as long as there was anything to eat, but when Jack Frost froze everything hard and rough, Brother Northwind brought the storm clouds that covered the green forest with snow. Bobby climbed into his warm bed inside the big hollow chestnut tree, which he called his, curled up comfortably, and went to sleep. He didn't care a hair of his ringed tail how cold it was, or how Brother Northwind howled and shrieked and blustered. He was so fat that it made him wheeze and puff whenever he tried to hurry during the last few days he was abroad, and this fat helped to keep him warm while he slept, and also kept him from waking from hunger. Bobby didn't sleep right straight through the winter as does Johnny Chuck. Once in a great while, he would wake up, especially if the weather had turned rather warm. He would yawn a few times and then crawl up to his doorway and peep out to see how things were looking outside. Sometimes he would climb down from his home and take a little walk for exercise. But he never went far, and soon returned for another long nap. As it began to get towards the end of winter, his naps were shorter. He was no longer fat. In fact, his stomach complained a great deal of being empty. Perhaps you know what it is like to have a stomach complain that way. It is very disturbing. It gave Bobby no peace while he was awake, and when he was asleep, it gave him bad dreams. Bobby knew very well that no fairies had anything to do with those dreams. They came from a bothersome, empty, complaining stomach and nothing else. One day, Bobby had the worst dream of all. He had prowled around a little the night before, but had found nothing wherewith to satisfy his bothersome stomach. So he had gone back to bed, very much out of sorts, and almost as soon as he was asleep, he had begun to dream. At first, the dreams were not so very bad. though bad enough. They were mostly of delicious things to eat, which always disappeared just as he was about to taste them. They made him grunt funny little grunts and snarl funny little impatient snarls in his sleep, you know. But at last he began to have a really, truly bad dream. It was one of the worst dreams Bobby ever had had. He dreamed that he was walking through the green forest, minding his own affairs, when he met a great giant. Being afraid of the great giant, he ran with all his might and hid in a hollow log. No sooner was he inside that hollow log than up came the great giant and began to beat on that hollow log with a great club. Every blow made a terrible noise inside that hollow log. It was like being inside a drum with someone beating it. It filled Bobby's ears with a dreadful roaring. It made his head ache as if it would split. It sent cold shivers all over him. It filled him with dreadful fear and despair. Yes, indeed, it was a bad dream. A very, very bad dream. Chapter 2. Bobby Bites His Own Tail. Oh, tell me, someone, if you will, am I awake or dreaming still? So cried Bobby Coon, to no one in particular, because no one was there to hear him. Bobby was in a dreadful state of mind. He couldn't tell for the life of him whether he was awake or asleep and dreaming, and I cannot think of a much worse state of mind than that, can you? There was that dreadful dream Bobby had had, the dream of the dreadful giant who had chased him into a hollow log and then beat on that log with a great club, frightening Bobby almost to death, filling his ears with a terrible roaring sound that made his head ache and sending cold shivers all over him. Bobby was trying to make up his mind to rush out of that hollow log in spite of the dreadful giant, all in his dream, you know, when suddenly his eyes flew open, and there he was, safe in his bed in the hollow chestnut tree which he called his own. Bobby gave a happy little sigh of relief. It seemed so good to find that dreadful experience only a dream. "Phew!" he exclaimed. "That was a bad, bad dream." And then right on top of that, he gave a little squeal of fear. There was that awful pounding again. Was he still dreaming? Was he awake? For the life of him, Bobby couldn't tell. There was that same dreadful pounding he had heard in the hollow log, but he wasn't in the hollow log. He was safe at home in his own warm bed. Had he somehow reached home without knowing it, in the strange way that things are done in dreams, and had the dreadful giant followed him? That must be it. It must be that he was still dreaming. He wished that he would wake up. Bobby closed his eyes as tightly as he knew how for a few minutes. Pound, 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 sounded the dreadful blows. Then he opened his eyes. Surely this was his hollow tree, and certainly he felt very much awake. There was the sunlight peeping in at his doorway high overhead, yet still those dreadful blows sounded. Pound, pound, pound. His head ached still harder than ever, and with every blow he jumped, and a cold shiver ran over him from the roots of his tail to the tip of his nose. Never in all his life had Bobby known such a mixed-up feeling. "Is this I, or isn't it I?" he whimpered. "Am I dreaming and think I'm awake, or am I awake and still dreaming? I know what I'll do. I'll bite my tail, and if I feel it, I'll know that I must be awake." So Bobby took the tip of his tail in his mouth and bit it gently. Then he wondered if he really did feel it, or just seemed to feel it. So he bit it again, and this time he bit harder. "Ouch!" cried Bobby. "That hurt. I must be awake. I'm sure I'm awake. But if I'm awake, what dreadful thing is happening? Is there a real giant outside pounding on my tree?" Then Bobby noticed something else. With every blow, his house seemed to tremble. At first, he thought he imagined it, but when he put his hands against the wall, he felt it tremble. It gave him a horrid sinking feeling inside. He was sure now that he was awake, very much awake. He was sure, too, that something dreadful was happening to his hollow tree, and he couldn't imagine what it could be. And what is more, he was afraid to climb up to his doorway and look out to see. Chapter 3. Bobby's Dreadful Fright. Poor, poor Bobby Coon. Now he was sure that he was really and truly awake. He almost wished that he hadn't tried to find out. It would have been some little comfort to have been able to keep his first feeling that maybe it was all a bad dream. But now that he knew positively he was awake, he knew that this terrible pounding, which at first had been part of that bad dream, was also real. The truth is, he could no longer doubt that something terrible was happening to his house, the big hollow chestnut tree he had lived in so long. With every blow, and the blows followed each other so fast that he couldn't count them, the big tree trembled, and Bobby trembled with it. What could it mean? What could be going on outside? He wanted to climb up to his doorway and look out, but somehow he didn't dare to. He was afraid of what he might see. Yes, sir, Bobby Coon was afraid to climb up to his doorway and look out for fear he might see something that would frighten him more than he was already frightened, though how he could possibly have been any more frightened, I don't know. Yet all the time it didn't seem to him that he could stay where he was another minute. No, sir, it didn't. He was too frightened to go out and too frightened to stay. Now, can you think of anything worse than that? The tree trembled more and more, and by it began to do more than tremble. With a very dreadful sinking of his heart, Bobby felt his house beginning to sway, that is, move a little from side to side. A new fear drove everything else out of his head, the fear that his house might be going to fall. He couldn't believe that this could be true, yet he had the feeling that it was so. He couldn't get rid of it. He had lived in that house a long, long time, and never in all that long, long time had he once had such a feeling as now possessed him. Many a time had rough brother North Wind used all his strength against that big chestnut tree. Sometimes he had made it tremble ever so little, but that was all, and Bobby, curled up in a snug bed, had laughed at rough brother North Wind. He just couldn't imagine anything really happening to his tree. But something was happening now. There wasn't the smallest doubt about it. The great old tree shivered and shook with every blow. At last, Bobby could stand it no longer. He just had to know what was happening and what it all meant. With his teeth chattering with fright, he crawled up to his doorway and looked down. Badly frightened as he was, what he saw frightened him still more. It frightened him so that he let go his hold and tumbled down to his bed. Of course that didn't hurt him, because it was soft, and in a minute he was scrambling up to his doorway again. "What shall I do? What can I do?" whimpered Bobby Coon as he looked down with frightened eyes. "I can't run, and I can't stay. What can I do? What can I do?" Bobby Coon was horribly frightened. There was no doubt about it. He was horribly frightened. Have you guessed what it was that he saw? Well, it was Farmer Brown and Farmer Brown's boy chopping down the big chestnut tree which had been Bobby's home for so long, and looking on was Bowser the Hound. Chapter 4. Bowser Finds Someone at Home. Now that Bobby Coon knew what it was that had frightened him so, he felt no better than before. In fact, he felt worse. Before, he had imagined all sorts of dreadful things, but nothing that he had imagined was as bad as what he now knew to be a fact. His house, the big hollow chestnut tree in which he had lived so long and in which he had gone to sleep so happily at the beginning of winter, was being cut down by Farmer Brown's boy and Farmer Brown himself, and Bowser the Hound was looking on. There was no other tree near enough to jump to. The only way out was down right where those keen axes were at work and where Bowser sat watching. What chance was there for him? None. Not the least chance in the world. At least, that is the way Bobby felt about it. That was because he didn't know Farmer Brown and Farmer Brown's boy. You see, all this time that Bobby Coon had been having such a very dreadful time, Farmer Brown and Farmer Brown's boy and Bowser the Hound had known nothing at all about it. Bobby Coon hadn't once entered the heads of any of them. None of them knew that the big chestnut tree was Bobby's home. If Farmer Brown's boy had known it, I suspect that he would have found some good excuse for not cutting it. But he didn't, and so he swung his axe with a will, for he wanted to show his father that he could do a man's work. Why were they cutting down that big chestnut tree? Well, you see, that tree was practically dead, so Farmer Brown had decided that it could be of use in no way now save as wood for the fires at home. If it were cut down, the young trees springing up around it would have a better chance to grow. It would be better to cut it now than to allow it to stand, growing weaker all the time, until at last it should fall in some great storm and perhaps break down some of the young trees about it. Now, if Bobby Coon had known Farmer Brown and Farmer Brown's boy as Tommy Tit the Chickadee knew them, and as Happy Jack Squirrel knew them, and as some others knew them, he would have climbed right straight down that tree without the teeniest, weeniest bit of fear of them. He would have known that he was perfectly safe, but he didn't know them, and so he felt both helpless and hopeless, and this is a very dreadful feeling indeed. For a little while, he peeped out of his doorway, watching the keen axes and the flying yellow chips. Then he crept miserably back to bed to wait for the worst. He just didn't know what else to do. By and by, there was a dreadful crack, and another and another. Farmer Brown shouted. So did Farmer Brown's boy. Bowser the Hound barked excitedly. Slowly, the big tree began to lean over. Then it moved faster and faster, and Bobby Coon felt giddy and sick. He felt very sick indeed. Then, with a frightful crash, the tree struck the ground, and for a few minutes, Bobby didn't know anything at all. No, sir, he didn't know a single thing. You see, when the tree hit the ground, Bobby was thrown against the side of his house so hard that all the wind was knocked from his body, and all his senses were knocked from his head. When after a little they returned to him, Bobby discovered that the tree had fallen in such a way that the hole which had been his doorway was partly closed. He was a prisoner in his own house. He didn't mind this so much as you might expect. He began to hope ever so little. He began to hope that Farmer Brown and his boy wouldn't find that hollow, and after a while they would go away, and then Bowser the Hound upset all hope. He came over to the fallen tree and began to sniff along the trunk. When he reached the partly closed hole, which was Bobby's doorway, he began to whine and bark excitedly. He would stick his nose in as far as he could, sniff, then lift his head and bark. After that, he would scratch frantically at the hole. "Hello," exclaimed Farmer Brown's boy. "Bowser has found someone at home. I wonder who it can be."
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fighting Moose Podcast. Please join us next time as we read another exciting story. Today's music was provided by the artist Analog by Nature, and the audio clips were provided from NASA. For more information to download and or listen to audio or materials from all our recordings, or to contact us, please visit www.thefightingmoose.com, or you can follow the links in the show notes. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcast or on iTunes, and tell a friend. Thank you for your patronage, and as always, try and do a random act of kindness every day.
Mission complete, Houston. After serving the world for over 30 years, the space shuttle turned its place in history and it's come to a final stop.